Chapter 8, Section 5, Settling the Great Plains. Despite resistance from tribes of the Great Plains, settlers continued to migrate there during the second half of the 19th century. They ventured on foot, horseback, and in ox-drawn wagons. Later they came by rail. Most had one goal, the opportunity to turn a plot of grassland into a farm. Opportunities and challenges on the Great Plains. Several factors transformed the Great Plains from a place to pass through en route to the West Coast into a land of opportunity. Perhaps the most important was the steady expansion of railroads. The railroads carried settlers onto the plains, and the railroad companies sold settlers land that the companies had been granted by the government. Another factor was that families felt much safer migrating to the west because the army had reduced the threat of attacks by plains tribes. A third factor was the passage in 1862 of two federal laws that encouraged settlement. The two new laws were the Homestead Act and the Morrill Land-Grant Act. The Homestead Act was designed to provide tracts of land called homesteads to settlers in the West. The act offered 160 acres of public land for a small fee to anyone who agreed to work the land and live on it for 5 years. This law attracted about 600,000 farmers who claimed more than 80 million acres of land by the end of the 19th century. The Morrill Land-Grant Act gave each state large tracts of public land to help finance the establishment of agricultural colleges. To raise funds to build colleges, states sold homesteads to settlers. The plains offered settlers a fresh start. Settlers knew by the look and smell of the rich soil that crops would thrive in this land. To be successful, however, they had to overcome some difficult challenges. The first was building houses on the largely treeless plains. Lacking lumber, some homesteaders simply dug a hole in the side of a hill as a shelter. Other settlers fashioned houses out of the tough plains turf or sod. They called these houses soddies. Sod blocks cut out of the ground with a shovel or an axe formed the walls. Most roofs were made of sod as well. Once farmers could afford lumber delivered by train, they replaced their dugouts and soddies with wood frame houses. Another challenge was the environment. The Great Plains region typically has an arid climate. The settlers who flocked there in the 1870s and 1880s arrived during an abnormally wet period. The unusual amounts of rain helped crops flourish. Still, farmers had to deal with winter's deep cold, piercing winds, and blizzard snows. By the early 1890s, drought conditions had returned, especially in Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, and the Dakotas. As the soil dried up, wheat, corn, and other crops failed. Farmers also had to contend with grasshoppers. Great clouds of these pests, thick enough to darken the sky, descended on fields with little warning. They chewed for days on everything edible, destroying entire crops. In the face of these hardships, many farmers left the plains. The sides of their covered wagons bore the words, "In God we trusted, in Kansas we busted." Others worked to overcome the harsh conditions by using dry farming techniques. To conserve soil moisture, they plowed and planted a field one year and left it uncultivated the next. Also, tools made farm life easier. The steel plow, invented in 1837, made it easier to cut through the thick prairie sod and prepare it for planting. The mechanical reaper neatly cut and bound sheaves of grain at harvest time. Windmills pumped water from deep wells for household use and irrigation. African Americans see the plains as the promised land. The women and men who settled the West represented a broad range of Americans. Many were native-born white farm families from the Midwest. Some had moved at least once before. Other settlers were immigrants from Europe. Often they were lured by the claims of railroad agents, skilled at stretching the truth. Still others were former slaves searching for the opportunity to own their own land. After the Civil War, many African Americans fled the South in search of better lives elsewhere. Thousands joined the westward movement. Freedmen worked as cowboys in Texas. They also joined the army, helping to protect settlers. However, most African Americans who headed west became farmers. Former slaves such as Henry Adams and Benjamin Pap Singleton encouraged African Americans to build farm communities on the Great Plains. These leaders helped to organize post-war migration to Kansas and beyond. The migrants became known as exodusters, a reference to Exodus, the second book of the Bible, which recounts the Israelites' escape from slavery in Egypt. The beginning of their journey to the Promised Land. Offered the opportunity to succeed or fail on their own terms as independent farmers, thousands of African Americans made the trek to Kansas. Some bought farmland and formed new communities, such as Nicodemus, a town of about 700 black settlers from Kentucky. Others found work in towns on farms in Texas, Oklahoma, and other plain states. Despite their rising numbers and the independence that came with owning land, African Americans in the West still faced racism. For example, when a group of black migrants from Mississippi tried to settle in Lincoln, Nebraska, white townspeople drove them away. The migrants persisted, however, and Lincoln eventually accepted black residents into the community.